watch it get drunk and do it all over again.
Time for us to go behind the headlines, and in today's story, we look at an op-ed that was published in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, written by the sheriff of Hennepin County. And I like to call this one "The Sky is Falling" in Hennepin County, Minnesota. Basically, the sheriff is looking at the Department of Justice and their recent failure, in his eyes, to do anything about legalization in Washington State and Colorado. According to the sheriff, all sorts of terrible things are going to happen because the federal government is letting legalization run amok. Let me just read some of the words for you from this sheriff. He is saying that, first of all, in one paragraph, he says, "We know that keeping neighborhoods safe will become more difficult for our men and women on the front lines because of the DOJ." And then in the second paragraph after that, or in the paragraph right after that, he says, "This will encourage other states to legalize marijuana." Well, which is it, Sheriff? You seem to be saying, on the one hand, terrible, terrible things are going to happen in Colorado and Washington because of legalization. And then other states are going to want to legalize? If all the gloom and doom you predict in the following paragraphs comes true, why would any state follow in Washington and Colorado's footsteps? The first thing he worries about is trafficking across state lines. He says there's an increased likelihood of trafficking across state lines. He pointed to states' audits that found problems in Colorado's medical marijuana program and so forth. Well, guess what, Sheriff? There has always been trafficking across state lines. There shall always be trafficking across state lines because you cannot repeal the law of supply and demand. People in Minnesota want weed. People in Colorado will find a way to get it to them. Because you can't control people smoking weed in Minnesota is no reason to use the heavy hand of the federal government to squash the people legally doing it in Colorado and Washington, two states whose voters overwhelmingly approved that legalization. He also worries that the increased availability of the drug will mean the number of drug driving crashes will increase, and goes on to point out fatalities with drivers testing positive for marijuana increased in Colorado. Well, Sheriff, all you're proving there is that more people smoke marijuana, not that the smoking of marijuana led to those crashes. It's all sorts of science behind this to explain why a positive test for THC tells us nothing about the culpability of the individual involved in the crash, so much so that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says so in their bulletins on cannabis. Furthermore, Sheriff, you conveniently forget to mention that the overall driving fatalities in Colorado are down year after year since the implementation of medical marijuana and will continue to drop under legalized marijuana. We also have him worrying about the youth admissions to emergency rooms for marijuana-related injuries. This is the supposed fear that there's a big increase in so many people going to the hospital rooms for marijuana, when in fact what we're talking about is marijuana-related visits, and a related visit is when you test positive for marijuana, or you admit that you've used marijuana. Go skiing, break your leg, admit you smoked a joint the night before, bam, that's a marijuana-related injury, even though you were not even high at the time that you were skiing and broke your leg. They also worry, the sheriff here worries in this Minnesota op-ed that marijuana is an addictive gateway drug that harms Minnesota's children. The gateway drug myth has been debunked so many times by so many reputable scientists that it hardly bears repeating. At least we can admit that in 1999, our own Institutes of Health called it a myth. There is nothing physiological about marijuana that makes you want to use other drugs. It's the fact that marijuana is lumped in with other drugs. There's more data to show that cigarettes and alcohol are a physiological gateway drug to other harder addictive drugs. But we don't call them gateway drugs because you don't get your Marlboros and you don't get your tequila from some dealer on the street who's also dealing coke, heroin, and meth. We need to separate the soft drug market, separate cannabis from those hard drugs like they've done in the Netherlands, like they've done in Spain and Portugal, lots of South America, lots of places, and found that when they did so, their hard drug-related problems and use went down. The sheriff is also worried. He says that he's seen firsthand in Hennepin County there's a direct connection between marijuana and violent crime. What you are seeing is a direct connection between prohibition and violent crime, because people involved in a prohibited market cannot use courts and lawyers to solve their disputes. They have to use bribes and guns to solve their disputes. When was the last time you saw a Leinenkugels distributor and a Pabst Blue Ribbon distributor shooting it out on the streets of Minneapolis? You don't, because it's a legalized market. He also worries about how many people who were arrested and how many people who go to jail that turn up positive for marijuana in the tests, which is kind of a silly and dubious stat when you consider that merely having or using marijuana can get you arrested and jailed. And again, testing positive tells us nothing about whether someone was stoned at the time of their alleged crime. He also complains the Department of Justice, this is again the sheriff of Hennepin County, Minnesota, which includes Minneapolis, also complains that the DOJ announcement sends the wrong message about the dangers of marijuana, especially to youths. Well, apparently we should set policy based on the message it sends, so I'm wondering if the sheriff can answer for me how we managed to send a message to the youth about tobacco cigarettes, the use of which is down to its lowest recorded levels ever, an addictive drug, a very addictive drug, that's available to youths at the ages of 18 or 19, depending on the state. How did we manage to get that message through to the children without arresting and locking up a single adult smoker? If we could figure out for tobacco, how come we can't figure it out for cannabis? He also includes the well-debunked claims about learning harms and IQ scores with respect to adolescent use. But even if these are problems among the adolescents, that just argues for carding them and putting the marijuana behind the counter and having it regulated by licensed dealers who can lose their license if they go and distribute to a minor, instead of a criminal who never checks anyone's ID and is looking for money from anybody who can bring it to him. Finally, he says that those in favor of legalizing marijuana argue that it would eliminate the criminal gangs and violence that result from illegal sales. These are false promises. There are no silver bullets that will eliminate the crime associated with marijuana sales, he says. Well, look, nobody says that criminals are going to stop being criminals. That's what criminals do. What we are asking is, why are we allowing them to commit the crime of selling and profiting from marijuana? Why do we give criminals that lucrative adult market in marijuana instead of taxing and regulating it and bringing some benefit to society from that market? The sheriff of Hennepin County, Rich Stanek, concludes by saying marijuana is illegal under federal law and should remain that way, and that the DOJ's decision will make it more difficult for law enforcement nationwide to maintain public safety. No, Sheriff, what it will make it more difficult for is your county sheriffs and all the county sheriffs that you represent to make their budget through asset forfeiture and federal grants that target drug users, marijuana users, and no other crimes. All right, well, it's time for us to take a break. And when we come back, we'll have our Irie Wednesday song, Gordon Green calling in from Spain, some music from Groundation. Coming right up.